I came home to a sold sign and a stranger stirring my sugar into his coffee like he belonged at my table. For a second, my mind refused to place what my eyes were seeing. The hallway smelled wrong, like someone else's cologne and lemon cleaner, sharp and bright, the way realtors make houses smell when they want you to forget people ever lived there. My rolling suitcase bumped the doorframe behind me, and the sound echoed through a space that suddenly felt too open, too staged. A woman I didn't recognize stepped out of my kitchen wearing my house like it was temporary. She had a clipboard tucked under her arm and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you must be Mrs." She glanced down. "Hollis. Hi. We didn't know you'd be back this early." Back. As if I'd been gone for months instead of 3 days. I stood there with my conference badge still hanging from my neck, my coat still on, my hands still stiff from the cold outside. I remember blinking hard, once, twice, as if the scene would rearrange itself into something that made sense. From the kitchen, a man's voice called out, cheerful and careless. "Honey, is that you?" And then my husband appeared. Gerald didn't look panicked. He didn't look guilty. He didn't even look surprised. He looked proud. Like a man who'd fixed a problem and expected applause. "There you are," he said, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "I was just telling them we'd probably miss you by a day." I heard my own voice come out thin. "Gerald, why is there a sold sign in our yard?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice in that soft, coaxing way he used when he wanted to lead me somewhere without saying it outright. "Let's talk after they finish up," he said. "It's nothing to get worked up about. Nothing to get worked up about. I'm 67 years old, and I've worked in hospital billing for almost 4 decades. I've watched people cry over numbers that meant survival. I've watched families split because of one signature on one page. I know what matters. I know what doesn't. And a sold sign on the home I'd lived in for 29 years mattered. If you're watching this, tell me where you're watching from. And have you ever walked into your own life and felt like someone moved the furniture while you were gone? If you've ever felt that kind of shock, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, because what I'm about to tell you still sits in my chest like a stone. That afternoon, I stood on my own front steps and watched strangers move through my living room, pointing at my curtains like they were merchandise. The woman with the clipboard walked them down the hall, chirping about natural light and good bones. Good bones. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I stood very still. Because when you've spent your life being the dependable one, the woman who keeps the paperwork straight and the lights on, you learn to hold yourself together in public, even when your insides are shaking. Gerald guided me outside like he was escorting a guest. The air was crisp. The winter sun sat low and pale, and the grass looked tired. That red sold sign was planted near the walkway, right beside the little stone birdbath I'd scrubbed clean every spring. I stared at it until my eyes watered. "I told you," Gerald said gently. "It's for our future." "My future," I repeated, and my voice sounded unfamiliar to me. "Or yours." He exhaled like I was being difficult on purpose. "Linda. That's my name. Linda Hollis." At the time, 67, still working full-time because I liked my independence, because I liked having money that was mine, because I liked walking into my office and knowing I could handle whatever problem landed on my desk. Gerald had retired early. Said his back couldn't take the warehouse work anymore. For the past 3 years, he'd been at home managing things, which mostly meant watching television too loudly and complaining about the price of groceries. We weren't rich, but we were stable. The house was paid off. My paycheck covered our needs. His pension was small, but it helped. We had routines: Sunday morning coffee, my rosemary chicken on Wednesdays, The same creak in the third stair that I always meant to fix. It wasn't glamorous. But it was ours. So when he said, "It's for our future," I felt something sharp twist in me. I waited for him to explain. To show me the paperwork. To say he'd made some mistake. Instead, he smiled, like a man offering a gift. "We're downsizing," he said. "You always said the house was too much work." "I said the gutters were too much work," I snapped before I could stop myself. "Not my home." His smile faltered, but only slightly. He glanced toward the windows where people were still moving through our living room, and then back at me. "Don't make a scene," he murmured. That sentence, soft, controlling, landed like a hand on my throat. I looked at him then. Really looked. His eyes were calm. His face was relaxed. There was no fear there. And that's when the first clue slid into place, quiet as a shadow. He hadn't done this in panic. He'd done it with a plan. "Where are we moving?" I asked. He hesitated just long enough for my stomach to drop. "A smaller place," he said. "Something practical. I found a condo. It's not far." "You found it," I repeated. "Without me." He reached for my elbow, trying to steer me back inside. "Let's talk later. You're tired from your trip." I pulled away gently, like I was removing my skin from his grip. "I want to see the documents," I said. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, something like irritation flashed across his face. "Linda, I handled it." Handled it. I thought of all the years I'd handled things. Quietly, efficiently, without applause. The mortgage payments. The medical bills. The nights I stayed up balancing our checkbook while he slept. And now he was telling me he'd handled the biggest thing we owned, as if I were a child who didn't need to be consulted. I stood there in the cold, my conference tote bag still slung over my shoulder, and I realized something else. If he could do this without telling me, then he had been hiding other things too. I took a slow breath. My hands were trembling, so I slid them into my coat pockets and curled my fingers into fists. "Gerald," I said quietly, "how much did you sell it for?" He gave me a number. And it wasn't the number that made my heart drop. It was the way he said it. Too quickly, too rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the mirror. Behind us inside the house, I heard someone laugh, a stranger's laugh, bright and careless, and it felt like an insult. I stared at Gerald until he looked away. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't going to get the truth by begging for it. I was going to have to find it. That night, I slept on the couch. Not because Gerald asked me to. Not because there wasn't space in the bed. But because when I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, it no longer felt like a private place. The dresser drawers were half empty. My jewelry box sat open, rearranged. Even the lamp on my side of the bed had been moved a few inches, like someone had measured the room and decided what mattered. The house felt staged. Like a lie that had already been rehearsed. I lay there listening to the unfamiliar quiet. The refrigerator hummed, but the rest of the house felt hollow, stripped of its small, lived-in sounds. My suitcase stood upright near the front door, still unopened. I could smell hotel soap on my coat, sharp and clean, mixed with the faint scent of rosemary from the plant on the windowsill. That rosemary had survived 3 winters because I refused to let it die. I'd taken pride in that. Around midnight, Gerald padded into the living room. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing slow. "You awake?" he asked. I didn't answer. He stood there for a moment, then sighed and went back to bed. No apology. No explanation. Just irritation. Like I was being unreasonable by existing in his discomfort. The next morning, The house was empty. The strangers were gone. The clipboard woman. The murmured praise. All of it. Only the sign remained outside, planted deep into the soil like a declaration. Gerald had left early. A note sat on the counter in his neat, slanted handwriting. Had errands. We'll talk tonight. I made coffee and drank it standing at the sink, staring out at the backyard. The birdbath was dry. The fence needed paint. Small things I'd planned to take care of in spring, in a future I'd assumed was stable. I thought about my conference, the fluorescent-lit rooms, the polite applause, the familiar comfort of numbers that added up. I'd spent 3 days discussing efficiency and accuracy while my life was quietly dismantled without my consent. I didn't cry. Not yet. I showered, dressed, and went to work. Hospitals have a way of pulling you into the present. There's no room for personal drama when a billing error can mean the difference between treatment and delay. I sat at my desk, answered questions, resolved disputes, and nodded through meetings. But underneath it all, a steady resolve was forming. At lunch, instead of eating, I called the county recorder's office. I gave them my name, my address. The woman on the line paused. Yes, she said. The deed transferred last week. Last week. I gripped the phone harder. Was my signature on it? Another pause. Yes, ma'am. My heart skipped. Can you tell me how it was signed? There was a hesitation I recognized, the kind professionals use when they know the answer won't be welcome. It was notarized, she said. Power of attorney. The words landed heavy. Power of attorney. I'd signed 1 year ago, after a minor surgery, just in case. Gerald had insisted. Just practical, he'd said. In case something happens. I'd forgotten about it. Filed it away in my mind with old insurance policies and outdated wills. Now it had teeth. I thanked the woman and hung up, my hands cold. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I went home later than usual, the sky already darkening. Gerald was in the kitchen when I arrived, chopping vegetables like nothing had happened. Smells good, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. He glanced up, relieved. I figured we could sit down and really talk tonight. We ate in silence. The sound of our forks scraping plates felt too loud. Finally, he cleared his throat. You're upset. I get that. I looked at him. Do you? He leaned back, folding his arms. I did what had to be done. I had debts, Linda. Debts, I repeated. What debts? He looked away. An investment that didn't pan out. My stomach tightened. What investment? He hesitated again. That same beat. The one that told me there was more. There's a woman, he said finally. She needed help. We were going to start something together. A business. The room seemed to tilt. A woman, I said softly. And you sold our house. For us, he corrected quickly. It was temporary. Temporary. I thought of the empty drawers. The staged rooms. The rehearsed smile. How old is she? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Younger, he admitted. The word felt sharp. Cutting. I set my fork down carefully. How long? Linda. How long? I repeated. He exhaled. A year. A year. While I worked. While I planned. While I believed we were steady. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping the floor. My legs felt weak, but my mind was clear. I'm not yelling, I said. I'm not begging. But you need to understand something. He looked up at me, wary. You didn't downsize us, I said. You erased me. Silence filled the room. I walked to the hallway and opened the filing cabinet. Pulled out folders I hadn't touched in years. Deeds. Statements. The power of attorney document. Its edges yellowed. I held it up. You used this, I said. He nodded. Defensive. That's what it's for. No, I said quietly. It's for protection, not betrayal. He scoffed. You're overreacting. That word, overreacting, finally broke something open in me. I smiled. Not kindly. Not cruelly. Just knowingly. Gerald, I said, you've underestimated me for the last time. He frowned. What does that mean? It means, I said, that I work with laws and numbers every day. And tomorrow, I'm calling a lawyer. For the first time since I walked through that door, I saw fear flicker across his face. And that told me everything I needed to know. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you, what do you do for a living? And have you ever had to use your skills to protect yourself when someone thought you wouldn't notice? Tell me in the comments if you feel like sharing. The next morning, I woke before my alarm. The house was still dark, the kind of quiet that settles in just before dawn. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening to Gerald's breathing from the bedroom down the hall. Slow. Even. Untroubled. It struck me how easily some people sleep after setting fire to someone else's life. I got up without turning on the lights. Made coffee. Sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, the glow of the screen lighting up the room. Outside, the sold sign loomed like an accusation. I didn't feel panicked. That surprised me. I felt focused. By 8:30, I was at work, but instead of heading straight to my desk, I closed my office door and made a call I'd never imagined needing to make. Her name was Patricia Owens, an attorney I'd worked with years ago when the hospital dealt with a fraud case. Calm. Precise. Not easily impressed. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. Linda, she said carefully, what your husband did may not be as clean as he thinks. That word, may, not clean, sent a thin current of relief through me. He had power of attorney, I said. I signed it. Yes, she replied. But power of attorney doesn't erase marital property laws. And if he acted in bad faith, especially to cover personal misconduct, that changes things. Bad faith. I wrote it down. Bring me everything, she said. Deed transfer. Sale documents. Bank statements. Especially where the money went. After I hung up, I sat very still. The hum of the building seeped through the walls, phones ringing, carts rolling down hallways. Life continuing, indifferent to my personal earthquake. That afternoon, Gerald texted me. Let's not blow this out of proportion. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone face down. When I got home, he was waiting, arms crossed, already defensive. You really called a lawyer? He asked. Yes, I said, taking off my coat. I did. His face hardened. You're trying to ruin me. I met his eyes. No. You did that yourself. He scoffed. You always think you're smarter than everyone. I didn't respond. I walked past him, opened the filing cabinet again, and began pulling out documents. Bank statements. Retirement accounts. Records I'd kept organized out of habit, not suspicion. That's when I noticed it. A withdrawal. Large. Recent. My heart beat faster, but my hands stayed steady. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the page. He glanced at it and waved it off. "That's part of the investment." "Which business?" I pressed. He hesitated. I leaned back against the counter, watching him. "Say it," I said. He looked away. It was in her name. There it was. The truth, finally unmasked. "You moved our money," I said slowly, "into another woman's account." He threw his hands up. It was temporary. Temporary had become his favorite word. Temporary lies. Temporary betrayals. I gathered the papers and slid them into a folder. "I'm staying with my sister," I said. He laughed sharply. "You're being dramatic." "No," I said quietly. "I'm being careful." That night, I packed a single suitcase. Clothes. Toiletries. My laptop. I left behind furniture, dishes, photographs. Things could be replaced. My sense of self could not. As I zipped the suitcase, Gerald stood in the doorway. "You'll regret this," he said. I looked at him, really looked. A man who had mistaken my calm for weakness. My trust for ignorance. "I already regret staying silent," I said. "I won't regret leaving." My sister lived across town in a modest ranch house. When she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She hugged me. Long, tight. The way you hug someone when you know words would only get in the way. Over the next week, I became someone else. Not overnight. Not dramatically. But piece by piece. Every evening after work, I sat at her dining table sorting documents. Highlighting inconsistencies. Tracking transfers. Making copies. The smell of her cooking, onions, garlic, warm bread, filled the house as I worked. Patricia reviewed everything with surgical precision. "He tried to be clever," she said during one meeting. "But clever men often leave trails." The condo Gerald had found was already under contract. In his name alone. Paid in part with money traced directly from our joint account. "He planned this," Patricia said. "Not impulsive. Strategic." The word hurt more than I expected. Meanwhile, Gerald's tone changed. First came the apologies. Then the anger. Then the bargaining. "We can fix this. I made a mistake. You're throwing away everything." Everything. As if I hadn't already lost the house. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat alone on my sister's porch, the air cool against my skin. I watched the sun dip behind the trees and thought about the woman I'd been at 40. Working, believing, trusting that stability meant safety. I understood her better now. I didn't blame her. I blamed the lie I'd been sold, that endurance was the same as loyalty. Before I tell you how this finally came into the light, how it stopped being just between Gerald and me, I want to ask you something. Have you ever realized that someone you trusted had been planning your life without you? And when you saw it clearly, did you stay? Or did you choose yourself? The truth didn't come out all at once. It rarely does. It seeped into the open the way water finds cracks, quietly, steadily, until there was no pretending it wasn't there. It started with a phone call from our bank. I was sitting at my sister's kitchen table, my papers spread out in neat stacks, when my phone buzzed. The number looked familiar. Local. "Mrs. Hollis?" the man on the line asked. "This is Daniel from First Federal. I'm calling to confirm a transaction authorization." My stomach tightened. What transaction? There was a pause. "A transfer request from your joint account. Your husband initiated it this morning." This morning. I repeated. Yes, ma'am. A substantial amount. I closed my eyes. Gerald was still trying. Still reaching. I do not authorize any transfers, I said calmly. Please note that on the account. Yes, ma'am, he said quickly. I'll place a hold and flag it for review. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the realization that Gerald still believed he could act first and explain later. That I'd stay quiet. That I wouldn't push back. I called Patricia immediately. He's escalating, she said after I explained. Which means he's nervous. Nervous men make mistakes. That afternoon, Patricia filed for an emergency injunction. Temporary restraint on asset movement. Notification to the title company. A paper trail that would make it very difficult for Gerald to keep pretending this was a misunderstanding. The first public crack came 3 days later. Gerald's sister, Marianne, called me. We'd never been close, but we'd been civil. She sounded unsettled. Linda, she said, Gerald asked me to co-sign something. A loan. He said it was for housing. For you. I asked. No, she said slowly. For someone else. I felt my jaw tighten. Did he mention my name? She hesitated. No. That hesitation told me more than her words. I think you should talk to him, she added gently. He's not telling the same story to everyone. I thanked her and hung up. By the end of the week, the story had begun to circulate, not because I broadcast it, but because lies don't stay contained when money is involved. The realtor called, apologetic and uncomfortable. The title company requested additional documentation. The condo deal stalled. And finally, Gerald's employer, his old pension office, contacted him about discrepancies related to beneficiary designations. Every call pulled another thread. One evening, he showed up at my sister's house unannounced. I saw his car through the window and felt something settle in my chest. Not dread, but clarity. I stepped outside before he could knock. He looked thinner. Older. His confidence had frayed around the edges. You didn't have to do this, he said, his voice low. All this exposure. I didn't, I replied. You did. He rubbed his face. People are asking questions. They should, I said. He scoffed. You always cared about appearances. I met his eyes. No. I cared about stability. You cared about control. That hit him. I saw it in the way his mouth tightened. She needed help, he said, as if that explained everything. You needed permission, I replied. He looked away, toward the street. You're making me look like a villain. I thought of all the times I'd softened truths to protect him. All the conversations I'd redirected. All the silence I'd carried. I'm not making you anything, I said quietly. I'm just not hiding you anymore. He stood there for a long moment, then shook his head. You think you've won. I didn't answer. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about being seen, by the bank, by the lawyers, by the family, by myself. The next week, Gerald's business partner showed up in the story. Not to me, but to Patricia. Her name was Elise. 38. No registered business. No formal agreement. Just a series of deposits and promises. She says he told her the house was already his, Patricia said, eyes sharp. That you were fine with it. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. That's his pattern, I said. Decide first. Explain later. Patricia nodded. The court will see that. When the hearing date was set, something inside me steadied. Not because I wanted public judgment, but because secrecy was finally over. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. Nothing dramatic. Navy slacks. A soft blouse. My pearl earrings, the ones I'd worn to work for years, quiet and unassuming. In the courtroom, Gerald sat across from me, jaw tight, eyes darting. Elise wasn't there. The judge listened, asked questions, reviewed documents. When Gerald spoke, his words felt rushed, defensive. A man scrambling to keep control of a story that no longer belonged to him. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly. I didn't agree to the sale, I said. I wasn't informed. I didn't benefit. And I didn't consent to my assets being used to fund a relationship I didn't know existed. The room was silent. The judge nodded slowly. The ruling wasn't dramatic. It didn't end everything. But it did something important. The sale was frozen. The condo deal voided. The power of attorney revoked. And Gerald's narrative, that this was all for our future, collapsed under its own weight. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Lighter. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply breathed. That night, back at my sister's house, I sat alone with a cup of tea, listening to the quiet. I thought about the woman who'd boarded that plane for a work conference, believing her life was stable. I wished I could reach back and put a hand on her shoulder. But I couldn't. What I could do was move forward, without pretending. Before I tell you how I rebuilt, and what I chose to take with me into the next chapter, let me ask you something. When the truth finally becomes public, does it feel like loss? Or like relief? In the weeks after the hearing, my life narrowed in a way that felt both frightening and clean. I moved into a small rental near my sister's place. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, beige carpet that smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. It wasn't home yet. It didn't have my history pressed into the walls. But it was quiet, and it was mine. I brought only what I needed. Clothes I actually wore. A few dishes. My work files. The old clock my mother had given me. The one that ticked steadily no matter where you put it. I set it on the kitchen counter, and when it started marking the hours again, I felt something loosen in my chest. Gerald tried, one last time, to pull me back into his version of things. He left a voicemail. His voice sounded tired, practiced. "We can talk," he said. "We don't have to do this the hard way." The hard way. I deleted the message without listening again. At work, I told my supervisor I planned to stay on another year. Not because I needed the money. I didn't, not anymore, but because I liked the rhythm of it. The hum of the office. The quiet satisfaction of solving problems that could actually be solved. One afternoon, while I was reorganizing a file cabinet in my new place, I found a folded piece of paper tucked into a book I hadn't opened in years. A handwritten list. Old goals. Things I'd scribbled down sometime in my 40s. Learn Italian. Travel alone. Have a space that's only mine. I smiled at how young the handwriting looked. How hopeful. I hadn't learned Italian. I hadn't traveled much. But here I was, standing in a space that answered one of those old wishes. It wasn't glamorous. But it was peaceful. The divorce paperwork moved forward quietly. Efficiently. No shouting. No dramatic confrontations. Gerald's lawyer pushed for compromise. Mine pushed for fairness. What surprised me most was how little I missed him. I missed routine sometimes, the way he used to hum off-key while making coffee. The predictability. but not the man he'd become when he decided my consent was optional. One evening after a long day, I sat on my couch with a bowl of soup balanced on my knees. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth, and realized I hadn't thought about the house at all that day. Not the yard. Not the birdbath. Not the stairs that creaked. It was like grieving something after you've already let it go. A month later, Patricia called. "It's finalized," she said. "The assets are divided. Clean. He won't be able to touch what's yours." I thanked her and hung up, then sat very still. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. That night, I called my son. We'd spoken during the chaos. Careful, surface-level conversations. He'd been shocked, supportive, confused. "I didn't know," he'd said more than once. This time, I didn't soften my voice. I didn't protect anyone. "It's done," I told him. "I'm okay." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. That meant more to me than I expected. Over the next few months, I settled into my smaller life. I walked more, cooked simpler meals, bought flowers sometimes, just because I liked how they looked on the counter. I learned which grocery store had the best bread. I fixed the loose cabinet hinge myself. I wasn't lonely. I was intentional. One Sunday morning, I sat by the window with my coffee and watched sunlight spill across the floor. The clock ticked steadily behind me. I thought about the woman I'd been when I boarded that plane. Organized, trusting, unaware of how fragile assumptions could be. I didn't blame her. She did the best she could with what she knew. What I know now is this. Independence isn't about money or space or even courage. It's about clarity. About seeing what's real and choosing not to look away. I didn't shrink my life. I refined it. And in that refinement, I found something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Not freedom exactly, but ownership. Before I tell you how I look back on all of this now, from the distance of years, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever mistaken endurance for love? And what happened when you finally stopped enduring? These days, when I think back on that winter, it feels like I'm remembering someone else's life. Not because it didn't happen, but because the woman I was then has grown into someone steadier, someone who no longer flinches when doors open unexpectedly. I'm 73 now. I retired 2 years ago, on my own terms. I still wake early out of habit, still drink my coffee slowly, still keep my papers in neat stacks even though no one is auditing me anymore. My apartment has filled in around me. Books on the shelves. A soft throw on the couch. A small table by the window where I sit in the afternoons and watch the light change. The house Gerald sold exists only in memory now. Sometimes I think of the rosemary plant, the way it leaned toward the sun. But the ache that used to come with those thoughts has softened. Memory doesn't sting the way it once did. What surprised me most wasn't the loss of the marriage. It was the quiet relief that followed. The realization that I no longer had to explain myself to someone who'd already decided what my role was. I did see Gerald once after everything was final. Briefly. In a grocery store aisle. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller, somehow. We exchanged polite nods. Nothing more. No anger. No closure speech. Just two people acknowledging the end of something that no longer needed tending. I walked away feeling light. My son visits often now. He brings groceries. Fixes things I can't reach. Sometimes we talk about the past. Sometimes we don't. Our conversations feel honest in a way they never quite did before. He knows now that stability isn't silence. That love doesn't mean swallowing discomfort. One afternoon not long ago, he asked me, "How did you know when it was time to stop trying?" I thought about it for a long moment. "I didn't," I told him. "I just knew when I couldn't pretend anymore." That's the truth I carry forward. I didn't rebuild my life dramatically. I didn't reinvent myself. I simply returned to myself. To the woman who valued clarity, who trusted her instincts, who knew that being reasonable didn't mean being invisible. If you're listening to this and you're still in the middle of something that feels uncertain, I want you to hear this part clearly. You don't have to explode your life to reclaim it. Sometimes all it takes is paying attention, asking one more question, reading the document twice, listening to that small, persistent feeling that says something isn't right. And if you're in a season where you're choosing yourself quietly, without applause, without witnesses, know that those choices count. They add up. They shape the life you wake up to years later. I don't regret the smaller home. I don't regret the quieter days. I don't regret choosing dignity over denial. What I regret is how long I mistook endurance for love. If you were me, would you have made the same choice? And before I go, if this story found you at the right moment, you can let me know where you're listening from, or simply sit with it a while. Thank you for being here. Before I leave you, I want to say this slowly, because some truths deserve time to land. For a long part of my life, I believed that staying quiet was a kind of strength. That if I endured long enough, if I stayed reasonable and patient and understanding, things would eventually settle. I confused loyalty with silence. I thought love meant holding things together no matter the cost to myself. But years have a way of teaching you what books never can. They teach you that peace built on denial isn't peace at all. That stability without honesty is just a pause before the fall. And that choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you awake. I didn't leave dramatically. I didn't slam doors or burn bridges. I simply stopped pretending that what was happening to me was acceptable. I read the paperwork. I asked the questions. I trusted the quiet voice inside me that said, "This isn't right." If you're listening to this and you're still telling yourself, "It's not that bad," or "I can manage," or "This is just how marriage works," I hope you sit with that feeling for a moment. Not to judge yourself, but to hear yourself. You don't need permission to protect your life. You don't need an audience to choose dignity. And you don't need to wait until everything collapses to say, "I deserve better." Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do, especially later in life, is decide that her remaining years will be lived in truth, not tolerance. So I'll leave you with this question, and I hope you answer it honestly, even if only to yourself. If you stopped enduring today, what kind of life might finally have room to begin?